Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to talk about grief, which we touched briefly on in our episode of Coping After a Loved One Commits Suicide. And I wanted to talk about grief differently. Some of the aspects of grief that might be a little bit more complicated is primarily what we're going to focus on. And I also wanted to talk about different types of grief. Usually grief is associated with loss. And
Right.
you most often think loss as in death, but I think there are other types of losses that
Right.
can attribute to grief. And it's certainly maybe not going to be as substantial if there is a death, but I think that there are other types of loss that are worth talking about. Loss of a job can
Right.
cause grief,
Mhm.
divorce, loss of a relationship, loss of
Mhm.
a friendship. These are all sorts of different things that can cause grief.
Yeah. So let's talk about grief. Grief is a normal internal feeling one experiences in reaction to a loss, which is
Mhm.
exactly what you said. But, in our culture, we've come to think of grief as only, well, mostly referring to death of a relative or a friend or someone. But you're absolutely right that there are other ways to experience grief. I think that grief is so individualistic, we all
Mhm.
feel it in a different way. And so it's hard to say, well, your grief over the loss of a job is not as profound as, say, the grief of the loss of my father, something like
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think that it's hard to measure, which one is harder. So in addition to death, there are four different ways, I think, to experience four different categories. The first one is loss of identity or affiliation. So for instance, you mentioned divorce.
Mhm.
That would certainly be a grief. Breast cancer survivor who has, say, a double mastectomy, that loss of that sense of femininity.
Mhm.
Even an empty nester,
Yes.
loss of that role of being a parent, or someone who leads a religious group or community and
Mhm.
feels that loss. So that is certainly, that's a lot of people. I mean, these categories that we're going to go over, I think affect a lot of people, maybe even more so than grief with death.
Mhm.
Loss of safety. So here's the second one.
Okay.
So survivors of physical or emotional or sexual trauma, they often struggle to feel safe every day. Families who are experiencing eviction, so housing instability,
Mhm.
they feel unprotected or unstable. Children of divorce, I think, can grieve the loss of that safety of an intact family.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um, and so certainly, here's one that I hadn't thought about, but of spouse who discovers their partner's infidelity. I mean, that
Yes.
that is certainly something that a lot of people grieve. I mean, on a lot of levels, because what I hear people talk about often is, I thought I knew who this person was, and
Mhm.
now I don't. And that's a loss. Because in our minds, I think we all picture, like you probably picture Curtis, you have this internal, construct of who Curtis is.
Oh
If
yeah.
you went out and you suddenly found out he had a double life, then there goes your construct, right?
Oh
Of
yeah.
the way you view him. And so I think that happens a lot with affairs. Loss of autonomy. So certainly people with degenerative illnesses, and Alzheimer's is certainly one that we talk about a lot. And often Alzheimer's is very slow and progressive. And I think sometimes people have that sense, I'm losing my cognitive ability. And so it could be also be an older adult who's no longer able to care for themselves. One of the things I hear, I can't remember if we did, if my Lindy's parents gave up their licenses. I think at some point they did. But for older adults, once you give up your driver's license,
Mhm.
that is a big loss because it represents freedom. And now all of a sudden you are reliant on someone else to get around and to get out. It's a tremendous loss.
Yeah.
I think people who suffer financial setbacks,
Mhm.
like even loss of a job. The fourth category, loss of dreams or expectations. I think the the one that makes sense here to me is a couple who really wants children.
Yeah.
And then there are issues of infertility. I mean, at some point you give it, and they may adopt, which is wonderful as well. But you do give up that dream of having your own biological children. And so I
Hmm.
think there is a grieving process that's associated with that. So I think all of those for many, many people can be profound if you think about, for a lot of people in our country nowadays in the world, there's a lot of instability. And so I think, there is a lot of grief going on.
Absolutely. And grief is a part of life. It's something that
Yeah.
everyone is going to go through at some point. And so we talked about the 5 stages of grief in our episode titled Coping After a Loved One Commits Suicide. And so I want to briefly go over the 5 stages of grief, but I also want to start with the caveat that grief is a very non-linear process.
Right.
It ebbs and flows, it comes and it goes, and we hear about the 5 stages of grief from, I guess you might call it pop psychology, or we hear about it in a lot of medical dramas is where I've heard the 5 stages of grief. And they often talk about these 5 steps that you have to go through. And that's not really how grief works. You can intermingle these steps and this process, and it can go any which way depending on the person. So let's briefly talk about the 5 stages of grief.
So historically, this comes from, I think she was a Swiss American psychiatrist, Kubler-Ross, who back in 1969 wrote a book called On Death and Dying. Now, so I'm going to go over the 5 steps. I have difficulty with some of them, I'll tell you, because they don't make a lot of sense to me.
Okay.
The first step is denial.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, maybe I'm just taking off my own experience with having both parents die. I never had that problem with denial. And, it's inevitable, but maybe it's because they were both old, or my father died of cancer. And so I knew he was sick and he knew he wasn't feeling good. So I never experienced the denial. Anger, I think anger is a common response for a lot of people. I think it's especially true if the death is sudden or by an accident, or it just doesn't make sense to you. Maybe there's something that could have been done. Maybe the loved one didn't take care of their health the way that, you wish they would have. And I think it's pretty easy to be angry about that.
And I think that's where denial comes into, is I think denial is more applicable to a sudden loss, a sudden death. I mean, if you think
that's probably true.
Like if someone dies in a car accident, your first reaction is going to be denial until you actually see that person. You have a confirmation, this is my loved one, and yes, they really are gone. So and that would certainly bring on anger of, at that point, your loved one is a victim of a car crash, and you're going to be angry at whoever caused that car crash. It's very natural.
Right. I think in the case of an accident or a traumatic death, I think there's a lot of space for anger.
Yes.
So the third step is bargaining. This is the one that I guess for me doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
We want to believe that if we act in a particular way, we'll feel better. And so bargaining, the way she presented it is we start to make deals with ourselves, or perhaps with God, if we believe in God. And if you're religious, that, if I act a certain way, then I won't feel such grief. But I think the bargaining, I always thought of it as, if I do something, then this person won't die. So that's one of the things, again, from my own experience, I didn't go through. Mm-hmm. But there's also this piece that kind of makes sense that I've seen people do in the office. There's a lot of what if.
Yeah.
So she puts the what ifs under that category of bargaining. Mm-hmm. So again, let's take the example of, let's say you love someone and they're a smoker, they're a lifelong smoker, and they get lung cancer. And so I think there's a lot, could I have done something to get them to stop smoking? If I would have done this, then they would have been healthier, something like that. I think, in that respect, it does make some sense to me.
And when I think of bargaining, when it comes to a loss, I think in terms of before the death happens. So if someone is terminally ill, particularly if it's a child or a loved one, you might start bargaining, can I take your place? Not that it's rational, but grief is very, very seldom rational. But you might start, begging with God or, anyone, or maybe just feel a desire to take their place. You would rather they survive and you not survive. I think that's how I would think of bargaining. Maybe it's like a prelude to the death.
Yeah, and I think I probably said this before in another episode. I think the hardest death to understand and go through is when a parent loses a child. I
Oh,
think
yeah.
it's so hard because it is so flipped of how we want it to be. We want to
Hmm.
grow old, we want to see our kids grow up, we want to see our grandkids. And then when it shifts like that and they die before us, I think it's incredibly difficult. And
Oh,
I also
yeah.
think that for parents, young parents who lose kids, often they end up, the marriage really struggles. And I think it's because the grieving process is so difficult
Hmm.
and it's hard for them to come together. And often I think it increases the risk of divorce,
I
which is
agree.
sad because then you just have another loss on top of the
Hmm.
loss of the child. The fourth step is depression. I have a problem with the word depression. Just to me, it means something very specific. I would call it sadness or extreme
Yes.
sadness.
Oh, yeah.
And so that part really makes sense to me that often we feel so sad. Now, depression to me is when you can't get out of bed, when you can't go to work, when it affects all sorts of your functioning. And we'll go into in a minute what we call complicated grief,
Hmm.
which is slightly different. I mean, I guess in some ways you'd call it more profound. Then I think you can use the word depression
Okay.
in complicated grief. But I think I hate to use the word normal. I don't know that what is normal, but in
Yeah.
normal grief or typical grief, I think sadness is probably more of an appropriate term, at least for me.
And I think it would also be very normal to go through a short depressive episode. I mean, if you experience the death of, say, a spouse or a child, you're probably going to have
Yeah.
days, if not weeks, where you're going to be in a depressed state. You're not going to want to get out of bed. It's going to completely disrupt your entire life. And that's very normal to go through that when you're experiencing a grief of that magnitude. But I mean, that's probably more of a complicated grief.
Well, and that depression, you're right, in describing that, but I think it's fairly short term in
Exactly.
a typical grieving process. And so
Hmm.
one of the, if you enter into that category that we call complicated grief, then it becomes depression for a much longer period of time, and you're having a really hard time pulling yourself out of it.
Hmm.
So the last step, the fifth step, is acceptance. And this certainly makes sense to me. I think at some point you have to get to that point of you accept that we are all mortal and that death is a part of life just as much as anything else. And that the reality of life is that we lose the people we love.
Yeah, which is the hardest part to get to. And it's going to look different and the timeline is going to be different for everyone, even
Mhm.
people who experience the same loss. I think that's what can make it so hard for couples who lose a child is they're going to get to that acceptance part at different times, and they're probably going to be in different stages of grief in different times, and that's going to cause a lot of friction. So
Mhm.
I think that's what can make it so complicated.
Yeah, but I think you mentioned this earlier, and I really believe this. That we cycle through these steps. It's not
Yeah.
linear, as you
Yeah.
said. And also, I think, and this was the case when my father died, and he's been dead for, oh gosh, 25 years. So it's been a long time. But I remember, the initial grief. I got over that because he was sick with cancer for a long time.
Hmm.
But then there'd be waves, and it felt like that.
Yes.
It just felt like that. And it could be, months after, and I just feel this momentary wave of sadness and what I'd call grief, and then it passes.
Hmm.
And so I think that's, true and in different strengths or for everyone that you should be aware that you can feel it at any time after. I
Yeah.
don't know that it goes away or that we would ever want it to go completely away,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, to to have the loss of someone that you love so dearly. We'll think about it every once in a while, and that's part of the grieving process.
Yeah, just because you reach acceptance doesn't mean that that grief is just gone. I think when
So
we
you're
have,
done. Yeah. I
yeah,
don't know that we're ever done.
I don't think we are. And, I think we'll come back to that in sharing a personal experience that I felt with grief that I don't know that it fits into the category of complicated grief, but it was certainly a confusing time for me. So, but first, let's talk about what complicated grief is.
So for complicated grief, it certainly starts out in a very similar way as what we might call regular grief. But I think
Hmm.
the probably the most profound aspect of it is, goes on for a long time.
Yeah.
And so if you have that intense sorrow and pain and thinking about the loss of your loved one, that it really affects your functioning. It might affect your other relationships for the people who are still around you.
Hmm.
It could affect, your employment. And like if you get to a point, and this would be the deep depression, where you're feeling like your life holds no meaning or purpose. And so
Hmm.
if you can see that, say you lost a spouse even, or even a child, which I think would be really, really tough. I can't even
Yeah.
imagine that. If you get to that point where you think, okay, my life has no meaning, then I think you're in what we'd call that complicated grief. And if it goes on for too long, then you really need to get help, I think. And I
Yeah.
think, seeking professional help. There's certainly people, certainly therapists who specialize in grief, but most therapists are good at dealing with that because often what you need is just someone to talk to and to go over with it to help you come up with behaviors that eventually will pull you out.
Hmm.
So I think does that answer your question about how we
Yeah.
might feel complicated grief? I think a lot of it is just more profound symptoms that go on for a longer time.
It's when you feel like you can't get out of it,
I
which can
can't get
be
out of it.
incredibly frustrating for a loved one who's going through the same grief, and maybe they have been able to cope and they've got to that period of acceptance, or at least they're able to move forward with their life, but someone else is just stuck in it.
Yeah.
And that can be really hard, and it can also be hard to feel supportive because you're like, okay, how long is this going to go on? And you know in terms of that, that's definitely not helpful to
No,
someone who
right,
who is
right. How
experiencing
long
grief.
is this? When are you going to be done with this? Yeah,
Yeah.
you don't want to say that.
Yeah, that's definitely not helpful. And so at that point, if I were in a relationship with someone who was experiencing this complicated grief that just seemed to be going on, I would encourage them to seek help, to
Hmm.
seek a third party,
Yeah.
because sometimes it helps to have someone who is hearing the story for the first time that can look at you and say, that's really, really hard. That's a tough situation. Because you feel validated when you
Yeah.
hear that, when someone can, say, wow, that really was the tough situation. Never mind that it happened 6 months ago. That's really tough. I think that can be incredibly healing to hear again
I
after
think
everyone
that,
else.
yeah. And then, so my first suggestion to anyone who's listening, who either they might be experiencing that complicated grief, or if you know someone, a loved one who is experiencing that complicated grief, I think it's important to get some good therapy. That would
Hmm.
be the first place to go. Our listeners who listen, they're going to know I'm not that big on medication. And
Hmm.
I don't know that medication is the way to go. This is a normal part of
Yeah.
life.
Hmm.
I think you just need help pulling yourself out of it. I think it might be important to talk about risk factors for complicated grief. It occurs statistically more often in females.
Okay.
It occurs more often in older females. But for some other factors, an unexpected or violent death, such as a death from a car accident, murder, or suicide,
Mm-hmm.
death of a child, close or dependent relationship to the deceased person, social isolation, or loss of support system or friendships. I think if you have a past history of depression
Mm.
or PTSD, then you're going to be more at risk to have that complicated grief. I think also if you have traumatic childhood experiences, such as abuse or neglect, then I think that makes it more likely that you'll
Mm-hmm.
experience that. So there are some risk factors. But again, it's a normal process. Some people feel it more profoundly and have a hard time getting out of it.
Yeah. 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 Exactly. So I'm going to share a couple of stories, and I'll start with my own personal story. And most people know I'm a very open person, and I have no problem sharing personal experiences. And this one really is pretty personal. So I suffered a miscarriage our second pregnancy. So we had our first child, and then when we decided to get pregnant with our second, I went to 10 weeks thinking I was pregnant. I had all the symptoms, I had the positive pregnancy test. I go into the doctor's office and they're doing the ultrasound, and all of a sudden the midwife has to leave and go get an ultrasound tech. And the ultrasound tech comes in, and at this point I'm starting to get a little nervous. And the ultrasound tech says, yes, here's the sac, but there's no embryo. Mm. And so it's what's called a blighted ovum, which is actually really common. It's where the egg fertilizes, but a baby never develops. Most of the time, this results in an early miscarriage, and women don't even know that it happens. Well, I was an anomaly because I went to 10 weeks with no symptoms besides pregnancy. And so my immediate thought is, does that mean that I'm not supposed to feel sad because there's no baby? How can I mourn something I never had? And so it brought on this flood of complicated emotions because I didn't know how I was supposed to feel. And it took me a while to accept the fact that I am grieving. This is a loss. This counts as a miscarriage. And to let myself grieve over the child that I never met. And, my grief was still very much real. But I think that, sometimes grief isn't always simple. And I had a great support system and I was able to come through it fine. But I just wanted to acknowledge that sometimes grief is complicated.
Right. But I also think women who experience miscarriage often, I can't say always, but often have that profound experience of grief. Lindy miscarried our first pregnancy, and we were actually traveling at the time. We were in Israel when it happened, and so we were trying to get medical help there. And it was an incredibly sad experience, and very, grieving for both of us at the loss of this child. So well, it's very real.
It is, and so the story didn't quite end there. So we go on to have another pregnancy, and they got me in early. So I wasn't, wondering if it was the same thing. So they got me in at 6 weeks for an ultrasound, and we found the baby, we found the heartbeat, and we're all really excited. And then at 8 weeks, I wake up in the middle of the night to a miscarriage. And I know this is a miscarriage. And we're devastated. We're both devastated. It's the middle of the night, and I'm calling my parents to let them know, and my mom's like, I'm coming, I'm finding a flight, I'm coming out. So the next day we go in for an ultrasound, and I kid you not, the first words out of the midwife's mouth was, "There's a baby with a heartbeat."
Oh.
Right? And it was amazing. And I'm thinking, how in the world can I still be pregnant after what I went through last night? And so what had happened was we were having twins and we didn't know it. And we lost a twin, which again was really complicated because it's like, okay, now I'm really, really excited because I still have a baby. I'm still pregnant. But now I have this twin it was the biggest emotional roller coaster of mine and Curtis's lives.
I can't imagine. That's an amazing story.
It really was.
Like that.
Yeah. And like everyone in the office was like, in the doctor's office was just ecstatic because, here it was they kept it professional, but it's always a sad case when women come in with a miscarriage and they're all just ecstatic because it's like, I get to give really good news. But again, it took me a long time to reconcile the grief of this twin, of this baby that I lost, that I didn't even know I had. And the twin didn't even show up on the first ultrasound. So they think it might have just been another blighted ovum,
I think that is complicated grief. I think that's an incredibly complicated story about the emotions, the conflicting emotions that you have.
Oh, yeah.
The loss of one child and the birth of another. That is hard.
It was, all the tears were shed.
Oh,
I mean, I shed so many
both,
tears.
probably for both, you know.
I did,
Right.
yeah. I mean, and so I still remember very clearly being in that doctor's office and finishing with that ultrasound and just hugging Curtis, and we're both crying because we're so excited because we're still pregnant. And so at this point they move us to another room to get a better ultrasound, and that's
Uh-huh.
when they say, "Oh yeah, it looks like there might have been another baby." And again, it was really emotional because it's like, well, I guess we had another baby, but we still have a baby. And so
I've
uh,
never heard anything like that, Liz.
I
That
know
is
it was.
complicated. I agree.
Yeah, it was. But I mean, still, just an incredible story, too. I mean, our
Yeah.
middle child, our second, she is our miracle baby. And the
Mhm.
complications in that pregnancy didn't stop there. But I mean, the point is at the end, we have a healthy, beautiful baby girl.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, that was a good thing. But so this leads me into the second story. And this is a friend's story who he was abused as a child by his stepmother, and she really drove a wedge into the family, a really big wedge into the family. And so 20 plus years go by and they have little to no contact, and then very suddenly she dies from complications of COVID. And so at this point, he's kind of like, I don't really know what to feel. I mean, I obviously didn't wish death upon her, but I had no relationship with this woman, and I want to be there to support other members of my family who are going through the grief process. But he didn't quite know how to grieve, if he even was grieving the loss of this person. And so I think that, sometimes people feel complicated grief like that, where they don't know how to feel about an abuser's passing.
Right. And the story illustrates a good point, and that is that often it's more difficult if there are unresolved issues.
Mm-hmm.
And that often happens between children and parents, or children and step parents, certainly like this case.
Mm-hmm.
That and not that there was ever an opportunity for that person to have any resolution, but I think it makes it more difficult, certainly because you don't know what to feel. Do I feel sad? Should I feel sad? Should I feel happy? I think that there are times that people feel happy or relieved, maybe not happy, or relieved at the death of someone else,
Yes.
which can also be complicated. So
Mm-hmm.
in this case, the story you're saying might have been, I'm relieved that the stepmother who abused me is dead. But I think I mentioned my father was sick he had prostate cancer for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
really miserable at the end of his life. And so at some point, I think as children and as loved ones, we think this would be better if this person went ahead and died, because
Mm-hmm.
the treatments are hard.
Yeah.
Treatments for cancer, especially 25 years ago, I think it was pretty tough back then. And so you don't want that suffering to go on. And so it's complicated because you miss the person, but you're glad they're dead,
Yeah.
essentially.
Which brings
And
on guilt
yeah.
naturally.
And so I think it's important at that point to really have people you can talk to about it. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the important thing. I think when you isolate and you hold all those conflicted feelings, those complicated feelings inside, I think it's harder. And the more you can talk about it, and I've used this term before, I think what we need is a coherent narrative of our life. And, each chapter in our coherent
Mm-hmm.
narrative of our life, like there might be a chapter, the death of a parent. And so we want to make sense of our lives. And even then, we want to make sense of the death of a loved one. And,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that is, it's done. It doesn't have to be a therapist that you talk to, it could be a spouse, anyone, a friend. But sometimes, having someone who is that, you might call it that third party, who is disconnected from the everyday part of your
Yeah.
life, sometimes that's easier to talk to that person about it.
Particularly in this instance, I would imagine. I remember when I was in high school, I was probably about 15 or 16, at the time, maybe even 17, and my grandma, my mom's mom, passed away. And I remember the first feeling I felt was relief. She had Alzheimer's and she didn't know who she was. She couldn't function on her own. She was living in a home and she wasn't really even herself anymore. And I just remember feeling relief for her that it was finally over. She didn't have to suffer anymore. And that's, I think, naturally going to bring on guilt for a lot of people because, you know, a loved one just died. How could you feel relief? You're supposed to feel sad and you're supposed to feel sorrow and you're supposed to wish that you could have had more time with them. But in my mind, I'd already processed my grandma is gone. She's no longer herself. I've already grieved for the loss of who she was. And now I'm just relieved that her suffering is over and that she can be at peace.
It makes so much sense. And I think that often happens with Alzheimer's. I mean, if you think about, we are our memories. We are our experience. It defines who we are. And so the grandmother that you knew is that culmination of her life.
Yeah.
And she loses that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a tragic thing, you know, to have a loved one to have Alzheimer's, and they essentially are gone. They're still there in the body, but they're gone. So I think it's kind of a normal reaction to say, I'm so glad this is over for everyone.
Yeah. But it's something that's not very often talked about because I think it brings guilt. It brings on guilt. And so I think it's important to normalize that when it comes to saying a long goodbye, when you have a terminal illness and you know that someone is going to die, we need to normalize that relief is going to be a very natural part of your grief.
That's right.
So, all right. So next week, we are going to talk about ADHD, and we actually will have a listener story to tie into this that we're pretty excited about. So this is listener Daniela, and she is from Melbourne, Australia. And I hope I'm pronouncing Melbourne correctly. I apologize if I'm not. How exciting is that we have a listener in Australia? So
that's pretty exciting. I like that.
Yes. And Daniela, I want to thank you for emailing into the show. And we are going to get into your story next week. And we're going to talk about ADHD both as adults and as children. I think we're going to focus primarily on adult ADHD, but we will get into ADHD with children.
And I will also have some stories. I have a lot of stories about ADHD and relationships.
Okay. It's going to be a good episode, and we will see you all next week.
Goodbye, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.